This is hot topic number 3. We're going to talk about function notation and domain and range that you can see on the Algebra Common Core Regents. I also have other videos for topics up 1 through 10, so please take a look on YouTube. We're going to focus on types of function notation you'll see, and we'll also just talk about the domain, which is the x values, and range, which are y values. So we're going to look at question number 6 to start. And a lot of these questions involve substitution. So they always give you what the variables represent. So like they usually connect them. So like height would be f of x. X represents the number of bounces. So what that means is they want to us to figure out how many times higher the first bounce was than the fourth bounce. So generally, if you have a ball that bounces, it tends to bounce high at first, and then after that, it kind of starts dying off. And then eventually, it'll just kind of keep rolling. So we're going to use that idea to help us figure this out. And it says first bounce and fourth bounce. Now it said x is bounces. So what that means is we're going to have to do one of two things. You can either substitute in one, and you can substitute in 4 in for x as kind of a start. The other way you could do it is you could take the graphing calculator, and you can go to y equals, type in the function itself. So I'm doing 80 times 0.5, the x. Now this, basically what this function means in terms of exponential functions, the 80 represents the height of the ball. So 80 is how high the ball was off the ground. Let's say it was 80 feet off the ground, like someone's dropping off a building. And then 0.5 shows us that the height is decaying. It's an example of exponential decay. So we're losing pretty much half of the height each time that we bounce it. Now I can go to second and graph and check out my table. So like I was saying before, 0, 80, the ball starts 80 feet above the ground. Now in this case I wanted the answers for 1, the first bounce. So at the first bounce it's 40 feet. So if I put 1 in for x, I'm going to get 40 out. And then for fourth bounce, I have the coordinate 4, 5. So at the fourth bounce, the height is 5 feet. So what I have to figure out now, it says how many times higher was the first bounce than the fourth bounce? Well, that means to find out how many times higher it was, we're going to have to divide those two values. So if you divide 40 by 5, you're going to end up with 8 times higher. So like in this case, the answer would be choice number 1. Now, similar to that, if you look at question 7, this one they ask how much more the car was worth. Well, that's going to imply taking the numbers and subtracting them. Now, on the other side, on the left side of this page, you'll see several questions dealing with substitution of numbers. Okay. They tell you f of x, they put f of negative 10. That means that you're going to take the negative 10 and replace it where the x is. Just be careful in the calculator when you're doing fraction questions. If you have a fraction, let's say you had something like 6 minus 3, and then you had 2 times 4 minus 4, what you're going to want to do is simplify each side of the fraction first. This is just an example I'm coming up with. And then see if that fraction can be reduced using the fraction option in the calculator. So the last part we're going to look at in this video is we're going to look at an example of domain and range. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write an example down. I'm just going to kind of come up with one. We're going to do the function x squared minus 2x plus 1. So we're going to we're going to use the calculator. We're going to find the domain for that and find the range. We'll write them as intervals. We'll use inequalities to help us write those. So like in this case, I'm going to go back to y equals. I'm going to clear this out, and I'm going to type in that function. So I'm going to first take a look at, and I'll change this so I can see a graph and a table. And that's the first thing you really want to do on the regions, so you have a picture and a table to go together. So there's my graph right now. Now, the first thing I'm trying to figure out is my domain. So the domain is the x values. And what I'm looking for, are there any restrictions in the x values? So as I scroll up, let's say I go to -10, and as I scroll, in this case, down my graphing calculator, I don't have any instances where it says error. Now, because the lines go off and the numbers keep going, that means the domain is going to be all real values. So I'm going to write the domain going from -infinity all the way to infinity, because the lines keep going and to the left and to the right. Now with the range, there's a restriction, because this graph turns, has a turning point right here. So what I want to do is I want to find that turning point. So in this case, I have my x on that turning point. It's the point 1, 0. So that means that every number around 0 happens to be above that number. So in the case of this question, if I want to write this as, there's two ways I could write this. I could write it as an interval, which means that 0 is the lowest number, and the highest number goes up to, would be infinity, because it keeps going up. The other way I could write it is I could just write it as y is greater than or equal to 0. And I would kind of recommend the second way. That's a little easier in this case. And that one shouldn't have an equal sign on it, that part right there. It should just be a less thing, so the numbers keep going. So when you're looking at those domain and range questions, first off, I put an equal sign in because 0 is on the table. If I can't get to that number, then I wouldn't have that equal part. So that's something you want to think about as you are selecting answers. And then the other part, like I said, if you are doing something with, if you know it keeps going and you have the infinity, there is no equal part on the interval. Okay?